Hello, let's measure biodiversity. So, biodiversity, as we define it, is it refers to the variation of species living in an area. The amount of different species, yung diversity ng mga organisms that are living in a particular area, that variation is what you call as biodiversity. There's a high level of biodiversity and there's a low level of biodiversity, but what makes us or what gives us an idea that indeed an area has a high or a low level of biodiversity? So we have certain ways of identifying that. The first one is through species richness. This is one of the common methods for measuring biodiversity. Richness, it refers to the number of different species represented in an ecological community, in an ecological landscape or a region. It is simply a count of species and it does not consider the abundances of the species or their relative abundance distributions. Minimeasure lang dito is kung ilan bang mga uri ng, say, plants ang nasa isang place or kung ilang uri ba ng mga animals ang nasa isang place regardless kung ilang piraso okay ng mga yon ang makikita sa place na yon. So ang major consideration kapag species richness is the type of the number of types of species found in a particular place. The second way of measuring biodiversity is species evenness. So in species evenness, it refers to how close in numbers each species in an environment is. Mathematically, it is defined as a diversity index, a measure of biodiversity, which quantifies how equal the community is numerically. So, if there are 40 foxes, as in 40, and 1,000 dogs, the community is not very even because the number of foxes is too small compared to the number of dogs. So, unlike siguro, you can figure that out. Yun ang yung pinagkaiba ng species richness and evenness. Okay, so it's pretty self-explanatory actually. The next one is disparity. So disparity is no longer talking about numbers. It is how morphologically, that is through bodies, bodily structure. Morphologically different species are from each other. Again, disparity, it is how morphologically different species are from each other. For example, an ecosystem with one species of grass, one rabbit, one rabbit, and a hawk would have a very low biodiversity but a very high disparity. Kasi masyado silang magkakaiba. Ayun. So, the next one is species rarity. For species rarity naman, from the root word rare, it refers to the scarcity of a particular organism in an area. Okay, so we are also considering this when it comes to measuring biodiversity. Kung meron ba mga species na masyado ng rare in a particular area and what causes their rarity. Ayun. Now, you may actually tell me na parang similar mga yon to the next ones. It's up to you. But the next ones are the considerations in measuring biodiversity. So let us call these as additional considerations. Ano ba yung mga dapat nating ano ba yung tinatandaan natin dapat when it comes to measuring kung gaano ba kataas or kababa ang level of biodiversity in a particular place. Okay, so the first one is genetic variability. Genetic, it refers to inheritance and those kinds of stuff, and then variability is yung pagkakaiba-iba. So under this, each population of a species contribute to additional diversity due to genetic variation. Kung ang main point lang nito is ang genetic variability, this concept is being taken into consideration in counting the number of species. Sinasabi rin dito na kung halimbawa masyadong kung halimbawa ang dalawang species, meron silang ibang magkaiba na genetic material, then that means magkaibang species sila, and that will mean higher biodiversity. Pero pag halimbawa ang dalawang species, kahit na medyo mukhang magkaiba sila, pero genetically they're actually the same, that is going to affect the biodiversity as well, level of biodiversity as well, kasi isa lang sila. Isang uri ng species lang sila. Okay, so that is the first consideration. When it comes to measuring biodiversity, kailangan natin consider ang genetic variability, yung genes ng mga species na present. The next one is productivity. Kung masyadong productive, ang ano lang naman ito is kung masyadong productive ang isang area, it may mean na mataas ang biodiversity din doon, and vice versa. Kung wala ng productivity, baba na ang productivity ng isang area, mababa rin ang level of biodiversity. So, low biodiversity ang level nun. Take these for example, ang mga rainforests, yung mga tropical rainforests na pinamumugaran ng maraming mga uri ng mga plants and animals and other kinds of organisms pa. Compare that level of productivity, dun sa mga areas like mga deserted areas na halos wala kang makitang mga organisms. So yun, hindi rin sila ganang productive, di ba? Kasi mababa ang biodiversity nila. Pero yung mga tropical rainforests, since mataas ang biodiversity nila, ibig sabihin din nun, mataas din ang productivity nila. And so next one is resistance to invading species. We have to consider this too. First is, siguro let's talk about it verbatim muna. Okay, so ecosystems with high biodiversity, they have greater resistance to invading species. Kapag ang isang place masyado siyang, halimbawa, madali siyang ma-invade ng mga species, say species ng weeds, invasive na mga animals. Kapag madaling masakop ng mga animals or plants ang place na yon, ibig sabihin yung biodiversity din niya hindi siya ganun kataas. And vice versa, kapag halimbawa mababa ang biodiversity kapag madaling ma-invade. Kapag hindi naman madaling ma-invade, mataas ang biodiversity. So mas diverse yung mga animals and plants na namumuhay doon. Yan. For the last one, maraming terms to. The fourth consideration is keystone, flagship, and umbrella species. So ano ba ibig sabihin ng mga yan? Umbrella species are species na selected for making conservation-related decisions. Sinelect sila consciously, sinelect sila purposefully. Okay, they typically because they protecting these species indirectly protects the many species that make up the ecological community of its habitat. So species conservation can be subjective because it is hard to determine the status of many species. With millions of species of concern, the identification of selected keystone species, flagship species, or umbrella species makes conservation decisions easier. Umbrella species can be used to help select the locations of potential reserves, find the minimum size of these conservation areas or reserves, and to determine the composition, structure, and processes of ecosystems. So what are umbrella species? At what kind of consideration are they? So sa dami ng mga plants, ng mga organisms, types of species of organisms na nasa isang place na perhaps is on the brink of parang harm, yung buong place, yung buong ecosystem. Ginagawa natin is we are identifying, number one, an umbrella species. An umbrella species is really important kasi dyan nakadepende yung pwedeng magdepende dyan actually yung buong ecosystem. So you can actually look for so many examples of umbrella species. It's quite a common term online. And pero for the purpose of explaining it fast, let's move on to keystone species, because keystone species are species which has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance, a concept introduced in 1969 by the zoologist Robert T. Payne. Such species are designed as playing a critical role in maintaining the structure of an ecological community. They're affecting many organisms in an ecosystem, and they help to determine the types of numbers of various other species in the community. Without these keystone species, the ecosystem would dramatically be different, or it will cease altogether. Ganun siya ka-importante. Some keystone species such as the wolf are also apex predators. The role that a keystone species play in its ecosystem is analogous to the role of a keystone in an arc. So kapag yung keystone that is under the least pressure of, and it may be under the least pressure of any of the other stones in an arc, pero kapag natanggal siya, it will collapse. Similarly, an ecosystem may experience a dramatic shift if a keystone species is removed, even though that species was a small part of the ecosystem by measures of biomass or productivity. It became a popular concept in conservation biology alongside flagship and umbrella species. Now, although the concept is valued as a descriptor of particularly strong interspecies interactions, and it has allowed easier communication between ecologists and conservation policymakers, it has been criticized for oversimplifying complex ecological systems. Kasi nga naman, you can't just say na, I mean, you can't just, kumbaga, create a simple statement that will perfectly describe the status of the biodiversity of the level of biodiversity in a particular place. Okay, so what are they doing ba? What are they considering ba when it comes to identifying umbrella and keystone species? An umbrella species is important, but it may in its effect to its immediate to the ecosystem is not that significant. Okay, but it's selected in making efforts, okay, as conservation, siya yung sinelect na parang isa-save para pwede ring ma-save yung mga ibang mga animals in its habitat. Whereas a keystone species naman, it is really playing a really important role na napaka-obvious. A keystone species, just like the wolf, yung role na pinaplay niya in the food chain in a particular ecosystem is so significant. Yeah, it's because it is also an apex predator. Now, the last one is the most siguro shallow one, kasi it is a species na chinus lang talaga para makapag-raise ng support for biodiversity conservation. Wala naman talaga siyang malaking effect. Wala naman talaga malaking effect kung magiging, wag naman sana, pero kung magiging extinct siya or mawawala siya or mare-remove siya sa ecosystem na yon, wala namang malaking effect. Okay, but parang they are used to just tend and focus on strategic goal, and the socio-economic nature ng konsepto ng mga flagship species is para lang masuportahan yung marketing ng isang conservation effort. Okay, so may ganun talaga. Yung mga cute na stuff. cute na stuff, that's actually wrong. Yung mga cute na mga organisms, usually yung sineselect as flagship species because mas nag-a-appeal sila sa puso ng madla, at mas makakalikom ng suporta ang mga gustong mag-conserve ng ecosystem na yon if they are going to put these organisms on the pedestal. So these species, they need to be popular, they need to work as symbols or icons, and they need to stimulate people to provide money or support. Species selected since the idea was developed in the 1980s include a widely recognized and charismatic species such as the black rhinoceros, the Bengal tiger, and the Asian elephant. More locally significant species like the Chesapeake blue crab and the Pemba flying fox have suited a cultural and even a social context. Ayun. So yun yung mga considerations when it comes to measuring the biodiversity. Kapag halimbawa yung ang pang-apat is ginamit, they're usually describing the biodiversity of the place to be quite low, kasi parang for na talaga yan, yung tatlong yan, they are for conservation efforts na. Kaya sila ina-identify. Kaya sila kina-consider as considerations. Just get what I mean. Okay, so now, aside from these main methods, yung kanina, yung about sa species richness, species evenness, disparity, and species rarity, and aside from these considerations, such as genetic variability, productivity, resistance to invading species, and keystone, flagship, and umbrella species, meron ding mga taxonomic methods used in quantifying biodiversity. So, taxonomic methods, it means we are using more like parang classifications. Ang ginagamit natin in measuring biodiversity is the number of it's the methods of taxonomy, of classifying, naming, and organizing organisms. Actually, parang ganun din naman talaga yung main natin dito. It's like tulad kanina, we're actually dealing with species, which is a taxonomic level, but the taxonomic methods, they have something different in them. Okay, I think that it's better if we just talk about them. So the first one is a phylogenic species concept. Ang konsepto na ginagamit kapag kapag magme-measure tayo ng biodiversity according to phylogenic species concept is that kailangan nating tingnan yung phenotype. Okay, yung physical characteristics ng organisms and as well as yung genotype ng species kapag sinaseparate natin sila. So, yeah, they may be phenotypically similar, pero they're not the same. They're not the same species genotypically. So, you can separate them, okay, into two different classifications. So, ganun lang kasimple ang mga bagay sa unang, It may actually be similar to species, tawag doon, actually, no. Yeah, it's not, genetic variability, yeah, yun, as a consideration. Maybe similar to that. Next one is biological species concept. For this, ang kina-consider is yung mating. Kung okay ba, o kung yung mga dalawang organisms kaya ba nila mag-interbreed freely, okay, under natural conditions, kung kaya ba nilang makapag-produce ng offspring, then that means they are of the same species. Okay, so yun lang naman yung kina-consider dito sa biological species concept. Kung magbibilang ka na, mag-identify ka na kung gaano ba kataas or kababa ang level ng biodiversity in a particular place. And the last one is evolutionary species concept. Ngayon, dito naman, ang kina-consider is hindi yung phenotypes tsaka yung genotypes nila. Hindi rin kina-consider yung kung kaya ba nilang mag-breed kapag nagkaroon sila ng mating. Hindi yun ang kina-consider. Ang kina-consider sa evolutionary species is yung ancestral at saka yung descendant relationship ng mga organisms. Na hindi naman pwedeng matrace kahit na anong pamamaraan aside from fossil records. Ang focus nito is on the morphological features closely related organisms. Dapat hindi mo titingnan kung kaya ba nilang makapag-intercourse or makapag-mate. Hindi rin mo rin titingnan kung ano yung itsura at saka yung set of genes na meron sila. Ang titingnan mo lang dito is yung mga similar features nila. Okay, so ganun. Parang ang focus talaga dito is kung magkamag-anak ba sila. Based from their morphological features and based from fossil records. Ayun. So may ganung consideration. So yeah, that ends the taxonomic methods for quantifying biodiversity. Measuring biodiversity is a really complex process. Nakita nyo naman, dami-dami niyang facets, di ba? The variety of concepts at saka yung yung pagpapakahulugan natin sa species na iba-iba. Okay? Di ba iba-iba yung pagpapakahulugan nila sa species? Dapat daw ang species they are according to phylogenetic species concept, kailangan daw phenotype and genotype ang kina-consider para maging separate species. Doon naman sa isa, sabi niya yung mga kung kaya ba nila mag-mate. So yeah, because of that complication or complexity, yung dami ng mga konsepto natin, pagpapakahulugan natin sa word na species, nadi-divide or nag-group together ang mga organisms. Kaya, yeah, ang dami-dami kasing mga pamantayan, dami-daming criteria para matawag na separate species ang mga organisms. So, ganun tuloy nangyayari. For one, consideration, pwede silang maging magkagrupo. For the other next consideration, pwede naman silang may paghiwalay. Now, that is now is a difficulty in measure that now is imposing a difficulty in measuring biodiversity because it's so difficult to identify the needs of an ecosystem that policymakers often simply choose yung most charismatic species para makapag-raise ng awareness and money for conservation, which is not actually always right. Now, this also in itself is dangerous because it poses the risk that the species that need conservation may not get to be noticed by the policies and may not even get support from those who can give it money or physical support. Ayan. So the last point I just told you is simplified as since we don't have one method of defining, we don't have one definition of what a species is. It is so difficult to measure biodiversity. Because of that difficulty that we are facing in measuring biodiversity, we're not having the perfect picture, the most clear picture of the level of biodiversity that a particular place has. And because of that, we feel that there's a need to conserve it, but we do not know which organisms, which species are at most risk. So what we do, we choose. And because we just chose and it's not really something na talagang fully, scientific and empirical. I think kasi, observations may be empirical, but iba pa rin kasi if we have a unified way of defining what a species is because of the absence of that, and because we choose now which is going to be the flagship species, it is giving these ecosystems a greater risk because we can't really pinpoint the problem, and that our conservation efforts may be put to naught. Okay, so it's not like all the time. The point is, it would be better if we have a unified way of identifying a species, of defining what species actually are, what a species is actually, so that we will be able to not just choose but really know which species and which ecosystems are in the most need for help. So yeah, this is the knowledge catalog, and I hope that you got something from this video.